thinking back to 2020, which was a reckoning for many on a personal level and on an organizational level, we looked up and realized that while we'd been doing or talking about diversity for a very long time, we hadn't realized the progress that we needed. And so for me, it's an indication that we need to do things differently.
Hi, I'm Shannon Lucas. I'm one of the co-CEOs of Catalyst Constellations, which is dedicated to catalyzing innate change makers to accelerate positive change.
And I'm Justin Scott Campbell. I am a DEI consultant and leadership executive coach.
This is our podcast, Catalyzing a Culture of Inclusion,
where we highlight catalysts who have taken the brave step of moving into diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership in large organizations. We hope this mini-series is a space of learning, encouragement, and ultimately community and connection. If you're new to DEI and or the world of catalysts, we hope you'll enjoy. So we're excited to have time today with Jackie Cureton. Jackie is Bitly's Chief Diversity Officer. She leads all DE&I matters for the company, building and advancing Bitly's diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy and goals. Before Bitly, Jackie had held roles at Deloitte Consulting and Thomson Reuters, among others. Thank you for being here with us today, Jackie, and thank you for your service.
Well, thank you both. Thank you. I'm excited to be here, and thank you for extending the invite. I'm super looking forward to this conversation. I think, knowing both of you well, knowing Shannon really well, and having gotten to meet you, I know we're going to go deep, and I'm excited for it. Thank you.
Us too.
Yeah. Thank you, Jackie. So as we begin the conversation, we'd love to start by hearing how you, as a DE&I practitioner, relate to the concept of being a catalyst.
Oh, wow. So I'll take it a step further before I even jump into how I related to my work. The first time I fell in love with the word catalyst, I've always known it, obviously, was when I really got to lean in and understand the work that Shirley Chisholm had done. She described herself as a catalyst for change. And I listened to her, and it struck me how pivotal the work that she did. It was not appreciated, but it was so pivotal. And again, I think it's one of those things that is not appreciated as much as it can be or should be. So every time I hear that word, I always go back to Shirley Chisholm, and I associate the courage that she had, the groundbreaking, the humor that she accompanied with it, right, to do what she needed to do. So I always think of her first. That's the image that comes to mind, Shirley Chisholm and what she did, and the doors she opened up. And again, it was really groundbreaking, and to me, it's still quite remarkable what she was able to do. So I always think back to Shirley Chisholm when I think about the word catalyst.
And for our audience who doesn't know Jackie, can you just give a brief synopsis of what she did? Because she was amazing.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I would highly recommend that anybody who hasn't, because I don't think I'll do it justice enough, needs to, look her up. It's a quick search, and there's lots of videos, especially towards the tail end. She's, sadly no longer with us. But there's definitely lots of interviews that she's done where she really gives candid feedback in terms of her experience. And so she was Brooklyn born. Her parents were immigrants. And so she was groundbreaking in terms of politics. So she was a congresswoman. I think she was the first of her kind. And she was the first African-American to actually run for president. Everybody thinks of Barack Obama, but it was actually Shirley Chisholm. And she was really going up against the odds. And her tagline for her campaign, which is super classy and I think is used quite a bit, is I think it was unbought and unbossed. Was it? And so she is a woman of courage. She's very feisty. Ran into a lot of discrimination in the halls of Congress and dealt with such grace and with such courage. And one of the lines that she would use that I think is really important for folks doing this work is she would say, if you're not given a seat at the table, bring your own chair. Yeah, like she was really good for really just challenging the status quo and creating that space if it was not afforded her. So again, lots to learn from courage, and definitely somebody I highly recommend looking up and just doing some research on her. Yeah. So back to how I relate this to D&I. When we think about the state of D&I today, everything that Shirley Chisholm did, and so when I think about, again, catalyst and relating it to this work, we need courage to do the real work. We need to challenge the status quo. We've realized over time, and again, thinking back to 2020, which was a reckoning for many on a personal level and on an organizational level, we looked up and realized that while we'd been doing or talking about diversity for a very long time, we hadn't realized the progress that we needed. And so for me, it's an indication that we need to do things differently. And for me, again, Catalyst is pivotal to again, being radical in terms of realizing the change that we need.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I love the connection with Shirley Chisholm. Thanks. So as you said, just pulling on that last thread, we can't do things the same way anymore. We need to rethink, how we're creating this change. And so I'm wondering if you can share with the audience, like, 1 or 2 essential skills that have made you successful as a Catalyst leading DEI, and maybe with some stories about how they helped you, or, conversely, we often learn by the times that we failed because we didn't have the skills. So are there 1 or 2 skills you'd love to share with the audience?
Oh, wow. I'm trying to think of which one. So I think it's important to, while I talk about courage, and I think it's important to have that for sure, and I think we have to challenge the status quo and be willing to do things differently, you also have to be open to meeting people where they are, understanding where they are. And so listening to folks is really, really important, getting feedback, really having good conversations. And there's so many ways to do this. From a practitioner standpoint, one of the tools that I like to use is really having detailed and I want to say intimate focus groups where you can bring people together and just have honest, open conversation, because underneath the lack of progress, there tends to be so many layers and complexities that we need to surface to the top to be able to address. So if we don't know about it, if we're not talking about it, if we're not creating this environment where we can, again, lean in and have courageous conversation, I think we get into this space where we're not really doing the work just because we don't have the knowledge. So seek that knowledge, meet people where they are, do some work in terms of understanding. It's really, really important to do that. We have to also, the other thing that I like to, again, encourage folks to do is just thinking about, we have this cancel culture where folks do a lot of, calling people out and shaming people. And there's definitely risk that accompanies missteps and misquotes. We need to really begin to lean towards calling folks in, right? We're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. There has to be the opportunity to learn. There has to be the opportunity to give grace a little bit and meet people where they are and allow folks to do the learning. And I don't think we do enough of that. So those are 2 that I think about. So listening definitely in various ways, making sure that you're getting to the whisper of the organization, especially if I think about it from a company context. There often is the whisper of the organization that I think a lot miss in the work that we're doing. And it's important to get tapped into that. Focus groups, one-on-one conversations is some of the ways I can think about. And then again, calling folks in and creating a space where we lessen the fear around the work, because a lot of people stay on the sidelines just because the fear is heightened for a whole host of reasons, and society, again, amplifies that quite a bit. And so calling in and again, allowing for the learning sounds, for me, is something that we need to really do more of.
And so for you, Jackie, thank you for sharing those. Those resonate a lot with me. You mentioned kind of focus groups for openness, and I'm curious too about stories of where you've seen these happen and work, especially with the calling in concept. For you, have there been any examples that come to mind?
So in regards to focus groups, so it's a tool that I use quite actively in the work, is again, really for a whole host of reasons. I think, I think we kind of do the same ones. We need to broaden that a little bit more. So let me give you a little bit more detail in terms of what I need. We tend to host focus groups for, again, demographics that, fit some of the areas that we think we should focus on. And I think we need to make sure that we're not leaving anyone outside of the conversation. An example I'll give is we recently hosted one where we were talking to folks who are considered privileged by society, and data tells us that they are. And that was talking to white men and just saying, hey, let's have a conversation because we need you at the table. We need you to do this work. But we want to do it across the board, right? So sometimes it's talking to folks for a whole host of reasons. Obviously, you want to talk to folks because of race, ethnicity, and some of the challenges that are faced, really important. It's important to understand from a gender perspective some of the challenges that are faced, sexual orientation, and even caregiving. And I think mental health is another part that's coming up a little bit more, where we need to have more focused conversations. And so where I see it really coming into play, you get to the core of, you have to create a space of confidence and trust, but you get to the core of some of the things that might be holding folks back, that if you don't have these conversations, you tend to miss. So we in this space tend to lean towards trainings and speaker events to get us by, and that's not enough. You really have to get to the core so that you meet people where they are, really understand some of the underlying things. And so I've used this tool quite a bit to help, again, surface a lot of that work, and then it gives us instructions in terms of what are some of the actions that we can do that we can do differently. Does that answer your question, or would you like me to
Yes,
go?
no, that's great. And I was also curious about calling in as well. Like, do you have any specific examples where that's worked, or for folks that maybe aren't familiar with how that would look in a real, setting or situation?
Yeah, or even if you could define it, like I hear the words and I'm like, yeah, that's cool. And then I'm like, but I'm not exactly sure what it is.
Yeah, so I think we see a lot of, and this is not talking about Bitly, this is just talking about society at large. There's a lot of calling folks out. So somebody does something, then immediately we run, and usually we do it in such a way, especially with the use of social media and the way news spreads and opinions spread really, really quickly. We're quick to demonize folks and judge them, and then that has real world implications in terms of many times it impacts their source of income, it impacts their standing in society, it impacts a whole host of things that I think sometimes is really unfair. Now, I want to be clear that there are many cases where some of the things that happen, we have to hold folks accountable. There's some things that are just egregious. I think it just happens a little too much, and we're really quick to cancel folks out of the conversation, and really just, again, really be harsh and almost play, the judge, jury, executioner in the same space when there's a misstep. A lot of the underlying beneath that for me is that we're not allowing for learning to happen. We're not saying somebody can make a mistake. And, many times folks are willing to say, I'm learning, I'm on this journey, I want to grow. Let's have this conversation so I can understand why what I did or what I said was wrong. We don't create enough of that type of conversation. Again, we're quick to swing the pendulum to the extreme and go into the canceling space. For me, so calling in is to actually be able to address why a certain comment, statement, action is wrong, and the reason behind it, and you give context, because hopefully when you have that dialogue, relearning happens for that individual, which is really, really key. When we don't do that, what we're saying is that everybody should be perfect and nobody has the room for any misstep, and that is wrong. What tends to happen out of that is that if we don't create that space where we're actually willing to have the dialogue, folks tend to not want to engage because a real fear sets in, and we lose out when folks are not engaging because of that.
Yeah, that totally resonates. And I think it's important. Like we have to keep people at the table, right? I mean, that's the goal there. What I hear in that, though, and it's related sort of to the next question, and it's part of the reason that we were interested in doing this podcast, is that's a lot of emotional labor on the change agent's part. Like, you have to show up non-reactive, even if they've said something that would reasonably cause a reaction in an emotional reaction in someone, so that you can hold the space and the grace to deliver that message in a way that keeps them in the calling in piece. So it's sort of a two-part question, like how do you do the self-management to, or the energy building to give yourself that energy for that emotional labor? And sort of connected to that is like, how do you get the support that you need to drive this? It's really a systems change. It's a massive system that you're taking on.
Yeah. So the first part is, I'm a big believer in well-being and self-care. It's a really important, and it goes hand in hand with the work, because you're right, it is really heavy. It is super emotional. When I talk about meeting people where they are, sometimes you're meeting them with their emotions, which also kind of, becomes something that you end up carrying or absorbing or being exposed to, which has implications for sure. And so without having habits that help you anchor and be prepared to show up in a way, because you have to show up for folks. When I say meet people where they are, sometimes that has, it's asking a lot of you. It's not just necessarily just being accepting, but you have to bring another level of emotional intelligence to the table to be able to read the room, read the situation. I also say it's important as a practitioner to know what's not being said, because a lot of the messaging is in what's not being said. And so you have to really, again, really invest the time in just, again, understanding folks, understanding different cultures, understanding different experiences, and exposing yourself to that. The well-being part is important to know when, first of all, do your due diligence to be anchored and centered when you show up for folks, but also know when you should not be showing up because you're not ready, because it's going to be too much for you to hold or to host. So just also be very clear, ask for the time, ask for the grace. I really do love that here at Bitly, we do have what we call mental health days that you can ask for if something becomes too heavy, because as the leader of diversity at the company, not only am I doing the work, in terms of the systems, the processes, the policies, I also have to help the organization respond to some of the things that are happening externally that impact us internally. We do what we call safe space calls, just to create an environment where we can actually have conversations following tragedies. And, sadly, there's just an abundance of them happening today, from the release of videos where minorities, are losing their lives or being murdered at the hand of law enforcement, or there's a tragedy happening somewhere else where a shooter has gone into a church. And there's just so many things that are being grappled with and dealt with that get very, very heavy, very, very quickly. And unfortunately, it's an overwhelming amount that is happening. And so you just have to really know yourself and know, do the due diligence. I do have some habits that I practice that just help me stay centered. And when I don't do them, I know it, right? I know it and I feel it. I can't go for too long without doing them. And when I in that space where I feel the weight of the work, I really go right back to them. They help anchor me. I call them my anchor habits. And so those are things that I do on a regular basis. And I don't know if I want me to go into detail, or we can pick up on that in a later segment, but I'm happy to kind of talk through what those are that help me stay kind of centered and anchored.
I think the specifics would be interesting. Sorry, Justin.
Oh, I was just gonna say too, as you talk about well-being and think about it and talk to folks about it, are there any like check engine lights? What do people notice in terms of like, as they begin to get towards maybe a burnout stage, or how do folks kind of identify what those warning signs are?
I think it's individual, right? So we all have different ways that it manifests or it shows up, right? So what the warning signs are. But if you find yourself, first of all, for me, the way it shows up is if I'm acting out of character, I have a trusted group around me that might, be my sounding board and say, hey, that wasn't typical, or so you just have a sounding board. So trusted folks who can be able to point things out. Outside of that, I've also really done the work, and you have to invest the time to know how I'm feeling and what's emerging for me. If I find myself short all of a sudden, if I find myself feeling, just drained or responding in a way that is a little bit more out of character. Again, I use the word out of character because sometimes it could be just responding in a very curt way, or, reacting to something that, doesn't really have the weight that you're giving it. And so, you just reality check. So I think it's really knowing yourself is really important, doing the work to know yourself and pay attention to those moments. I also know in my personal life when I show up, my daughter, I have a daughter, and she also is quick to call me out, I would say, though I say not the caller, but she'll be able to point out to me as, again, knowing me very well, that that didn't quite feel like, something that I would traditionally do. So I think it's a combination of having a circle that can help, provide pointers, but it's also important that you also do the work to know yourself and feel that.
Yeah.
Sorry, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Sorry. No,
I was
go
going
ahead.
to
Sorry.
say, so what I do is I want to say it's very simple, but it's very important. I have, my mornings are very, very important to me. My mornings are very, very important to me before I start the day. Years ago, I discovered the magic of the morning when everybody's still asleep and, the world is still, and I feel like, oh my goodness, I've got a leg up on folks, meaning I have an advantage here. And so in that time where everything is quiet, it's just me and the birds up, have my cup of coffee, and I do I do a combination of things, and it's not consistently, but I do them, these three things. I'll read, I'll journal, and I'll meditate, and or pray. I then follow it out with a workout. I've realized that they're all related. So if you think about the physical without the mental, it just doesn't quite work. When I do the physical, I have the impact on the mental. When I do the practice that again anchors me, which is around the meditation and the reading, it also ties into all those things, and it helps me show up as a better leader. I also observed over years, the leaders that I really admired also had habits that they all practiced, very different in character, but most of them really invested time in, again, it was either reading, and also their health and their mental well-being. They'll be very diligent about taking time off and really detaching, as busy as they are. So I think it's also observing some of those things and seeing it work for others as well, help me build these. So these are the things that I do. If I don't do them, I feel it. Maybe I can skip a day or two, but if I don't do them over time, I feel it for sure.
Yeah, thank you for sharing those. I think it's so important to have kind of a tangible way of accessing the health and the well-being part of the work. I think as I've talked to practitioners as well, DEI practitioners, the question comes up: what can I look for in an organization before I join, so that I can also be on that path to well-being and success? And what are some of the criteria that maybe you would advise folks would pay attention to? Because I know that, yes, we can do our own work as well, but also the external work stuff that we're dealing with can also, affect our well-being and the way we feel. And so how would you advise folks if they were wondering what those would look like?
So ahead of joining an organization, I think organization give a lot of clues, right? So, if you, at the very high level, if you look at what they're talking about and saying on their website and their social media pages and all of that, you get a lot of insights. We're also in the age where employees give a lot of opinions and feedback publicly, so you can pick up on things that might not necessarily be covered in the PR space. And so you get to pick up a lot of, again, if you do your due diligence, you'll pick up on a lot of things that might indicate a whole host of things. When you're going through the process of considering an organization, and I think it's so important to think about it two ways, because I think every time we're thinking about a role, a job, an opportunity, many tend to think about it as, I hope they choose me. It's almost like a one-way thing. It's got to be a two-way thing. It's got to be a two-way thing. As much as you're being interviewed, you need to be interviewing as well. You need to be considering is, do they deserve the skill? Do I want to grow here? I have this thing that I'm bringing to the table, this asset, which is my skills and my talent. Is this the place that I want to spend, X number of years doing this? And what does that mean? So I think there's got to be that again, two-way traffic in terms of selecting a role, a position, a company. If you have done the work in terms of your well-being and really understanding yourself, you also get to the stage where you build this muscle of being able to draw or create boundaries around certain things, which I think is really important. Again, so when you go into a position, especially as a practitioner, because the DI space is one of those things that there's a lot of passion around. A lot of people want to do it. A lot of people want to get involved. I often say everybody's an expert and nobody's an expert, because there's a lot of opinions that come along with it, and how to do this and how to not do that. And if you're working to, again, hear folks and still provide guidance and all of that, it gets very, very heavy real quickly, because you do want everybody involved, but sometimes that could almost, sometimes if you're not careful, derail some of the progress and the work that is being done. And so I think it's important to, again, be in a position where you're drawing boundaries, or at least have built that muscle where you can be very clear in drawing boundaries. The leadership is critical. Leadership is critical, and the level of commitment that they're willing to signal is really, really critical. You could get into a space where, again, a lot of organizations do this performative window dressing type activities and do the usual, work around diversity, equity, inclusion. Anybody who's been doing it for a while will be able to pick up on the clues as to when that's the case. In talking to leadership, you should also be looking for the level of commitment that they want. There are words that folks like to use in describing the work or, where the company is. Again, if they're not able to go deep in terms of what that means and talk about it and talk about what they can or want to do differently, I think that should be a flag for sure. Yeah.
And then are there any kind of quick performative cues that you've seen that leadership maybe show that people could be thinking about or looking out for?
Wow. So one I'll talk about, which I think happens quite a bit across the industries, is you see a lot of recognition and awards out there, right? So folks, best in this, then the third. If there's an overabundance of those, I think for me, I would always like to ask the question, well, how did you get to this point? Like, ask the questions behind how that was actually achieved. And the reason I say that is they're really important, again, for an indication in terms of how a company is doing. But if there's an overabundance of them, for me, there's something in there where is this the pursuit of awards, or is this really the work being done? And so there's a lot of, again, when we saw the pickup in this work in 2020, a lot of grand statements were made, a lot of grand statements and gestures, and there's a lot of PR this and again, commitment to either funds or resources or just investment that was made by a lot of companies. And then if you fast forward now, 2-3 years later, we're seeing the opposite. The pendulum is swinging in the opposite direction. There's a recent article, I think it was published on might be the NBC website. I'll have to think about exactly who. So before you quote me, I'll send you the links for the exact detail. But the gist of the conversation of that article was really talking about, as we're seeing this reduction in force, the DEI practitioners are disproportionately impacted in those who are being laid off now, which is a complete difference from 2020 when there's a surge to again, do this work, double down on this work, and to hire folks to help do the work. And then now as reduction in force is happening, the impact is disproportionately impacting those who do DEI work. What that signals for me is, again, I've been in the business space for long enough to know that reduction in force is part of the course of business. There are many times, and for a whole host of reasons, decisions have to be made. Including this, as difficult as it is, there's some of these things. And then obviously there's the macroeconomic conditions factor into it. When you're not being thoughtful about who you're actually impacting in that process, that to me is another indicator. When you see that, it's not across the board, it's not just to reduce cost, you're really targeting the space. That means to me, you approach this as a dispensable function within the business. That way, when you begin to look at it, you're like, oh, well, this dispensable function is the one that we can go after real quickly, right? And realize the gains or the cost savings that we're realizing. And so that's a little bit of what, for me, begins to emerge. When you see the opposite of a company doubling down and saying, not only are we committing further to this function because we believe it's core to who we are at this time, well, we're being thoughtful about hires, because every company, has to think about it. Any leader has to be thinking about the economics of the organization, obviously. But when you say, you know what, as much as we're strengthening in other spaces, as much as we're being cautious about hire, just to make sure that we're managing this properly, we're not going to cut back on this because this is important for us. We're going to be measured about it. We're going to be thoughtful about it, but we're not cutting back on it. We're going to double down on this because doing this now really makes it part and core of who we are. For me, that is really, really important.
I totally agree. And it's so interesting because, I come from the innovation space, which is how I met Syed originally. And it's interesting because companies have the same take on that. And the connection for me about creating diverse and inclusive environments with the ability to be an innovative company that's not just going to survive, but thrive is so interconnected. And the fact that organizations still don't get that today is just like, aside from all the reasons from the DEI, like it's just what should be done. But from the business perspective, it's so short-sighted. So I want to pivot into maybe understanding what are some of your biggest challenge, maybe one biggest challenge that you have as a Catalyst leader doing this work these days?
So I think one of the things that I like to encourage folks, and this is, I'll jump into, some of the things I'm focusing on here at Bitly, but I'll take a step back. Back to the whole my comment about, DI being seen as a dispensable function. There's a reason why, because I think the mindset has never been that this, is as important as, let's just say, the finance department or the marketing department or the people department. And I say people because I'm a strong believer that DEI needs to be a standalone function and not roll under the people function. A lot of times it is pulled under that, and that needs to change. So I'm really glad at Bitly that we do it differently, and that, this role reports right into the CEO, and partnering very closely with the people function, obviously, but partnering very closely with the finance and the marketing and all the other functions, and again, a standalone function. And so I think that to me is really, really important. The challenge is when it's seen again as a passion-driven project. I believe that we need to, again, stand it up in a way that everybody's responsible for it. Again, the example I like to give here is, while you have a CFO and somebody who runs the finances and looks at, the numbers for a company, every function lead is responsible for managing a budget that feeds up to that, and actually follows the numbers very closely and is committed and is held accountable, despite the fact that you have a leader. We need to do the same with D&I. Obviously have somebody in the role to lead the strategy, the initiatives, set up all of that, but every leader needs to own a piece of it. It doesn't get done if everybody doesn't own it. And that's really, really critical. It also needs to be operationalized. So again, when you think about some of the best practices in any function, first of all, you stand up a team. So one of the things that I think practitioners struggle with is, again, because of sometimes the view that this is dispensable, they're under-resourced. There's an underinvestment in the work. The investment tends to be around things that, again, are important, but are not necessarily getting to the core of what needs to be done. And that is usually around, speakers and, sessions that are just, again, having a conversation, but not really getting to the core, or the root cause, I should say, of some of the issues. And so approaching it as you would, if you were standing up a strategy function, if you're standing up a finance function, you would do certain things. You need to do the same for D&I. You need to have somebody who leads it. You need to have a team. You need to invest in it. There needs to be a healthy budget to get the work done. You need to be able to say, we're going to hold folks accountable. We're not only going to do that, we're going to do metrics and analytics to make sure that we're tracking, and we're going to correct. I think it's unrealistic to expect change to happen in a year or two. You can realize gains for sure, but it doesn't work and it doesn't stay sustainable if you're not committed for the long haul. And so when you hear folks say, it's a marathon, not a sprint, I know it sounds very cliche, but it's really important to think about it as a long play. It's not a short-term thing. Again, there's short-term gains, but it's a long play. When you've had a great financial year, you don't say, oh my God, we're good, we don't need a CFO. You don't do that. You double down and say, we've done a really amazing job. We've had a blowout year. Now that we've done that, let's learn from that and figure out what we're going to do in the next year, and the next year, and the next year, and you go on and on. You never dispense that way. So, and again, I use CFO, and I don't want to use it unfairly, but it's the same for any other function, right? You don't say all of a sudden,
I think
oh
it's
my God.
right.
Yeah.
Totally. Like you wouldn't say, oh, the market's down, we don't need a CMO. I mean, that
Nope.
just is something that would happen. Totally. And I love the connecting it down into the business. I have a million more questions, Jackie. Of course, hopefully we can connect over drinks in New York sometime soon, but I'm going to pass it on to Justin for the quick fire. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Jackie. And so as you kind of think about yourself as a catalyst doing this work, we like to get to know all our different catalysts and see what makes them kind of tick, and how they think about some of these questions that we're going to be asking. So the first question is, what's one thing you do to be ready for a big meeting?
Wow. I'll start off by saying, do the obvious, right? Prepare, go over the content, know the agenda, know who's in the room, all of those things. As a minority, as a woman of color, as somebody who is quite aware of some of the things and the complexities of all the things that we carry into the room with us. Imposter syndrome being one of the things, or even just being in a position where, you could be marginalized intentionally or unintentionally. One of the things that I am mindful to think through and do is remember who I am, and remember why I am doing this. It is bigger than me. Doing this right. When I started off by saying, for me in this role, I wouldn't do this if I couldn't do it right. I say that often, and it takes a minute for folks to really understand what I'm doing, what I mean by that, and when I say that, where that's really leading. spending time with me, it comes to life. Folks usually come back and say, you know what, I now understand that statement. The implications of not doing it right are so deep. They are so, so deep, and they go well beyond the walls of the organization. They go home with folks. It impacts the society. It impacts the culture. The same is true of doing it right. When you do it right, it shows up in the home, it shows up in society, it shows up in culture. So when I walk into a big meeting, as again, do the due diligence, know your content, prep, make sure you've done your stakeholder management, all the things that I would, encourage folks to do. Remember who you are and remember why you're doing it always, and then be who you say you are in that room. Why I say that last part is, again, around this work, there are many times you're the one who's correcting folks around certain things that can lead to some discomfort. You obviously have to build trust where you're able to, have very difficult conversations where you're saying, you know what, you shouldn't be saying it that way because of this. That takes a tremendous amount of courage to be correcting somebody who could potentially impact you in many, many ways. But if I don't do it, then am I who I say I am? Right. And doing it right, because sometimes it's, you could be addressing it because you want the learning to happen for the broader audience to happen, or the teaching needs to happen in that moment, but you need to be able to discern that. It could be pulling somebody to the side and saying, I heard you say this, or you said this thing, and it's really not appropriate, and here's why, and offering an alternative, which I think is part of my role as well. But again, a long-winded way to answer, again, do the due diligence, be who you say you are, and remember who you are and why you're doing that. So those are the things that I think about when I go into a big, big meeting, because then I have a voice and a seat at the table, and I need to use it wisely.
Thank you for that. All right. So next one is, how do you like to spend a free day?
Wow. It varies. It varies. So my daughter is a big part of my life, and she and I laugh a lot and have a really good time. So she factors into that big time. A free day, if I'm doing absolutely nothing, you could find me doing one of two things. I could sometimes be, having a catch up with an old friend. I could be binge watching something that I'm just catching up on. There's just a lot of, entertainment and shows nowadays. I love Afrobeats, so me jamming to Afrobeats in the background is not unheard of. So it's that or any other genre of music. Just my current genre is currently Afrobeats. So it's just doing the things that are fun and just, relaxing and spending time again with people that are good for me. My daughter, friends, family, that type of thing. Yeah.
Can you give us a link to a station or an artist that you like in Afrobeats that we can put in the show notes?
Be careful what you ask for.
Yeah, and I see such a connection there between the well-being component we were talking about too. The last question is, and I think you've answered it a bit already, but your favorite famous catalyst, alive or dead, and why?
So I'll give you two. And one I had the pleasure of actually meeting, but the Shirley Chisholm, I think, is, we definitely haven't given the recognition as a society, as just to think about not just America, but the globe, right? Immigrant background, came in at a time where it was really unheard of, and what she did was super remarkable. And I think we feel the effects to date, and we need to recognize that. There's a lot to be learned there in terms of courage and just really owning your space and stepping in there. And so Shirley Chisholm absolutely is there. From an African context, because I might have shared this, that I was born and raised in Nairobi, Kenya. So I now call New York home, but I also have a large piece of me connected to the continent. And, so Nairobi is also home for me. I've watched a lot of leaders do a lot of remarkable things there. I'll call out Wangari Maathai, who was really big in terms of environmental justice in Kenya, and Winnie Mandela. I know sometimes folks think about, a whole host of things, and I don't necessarily lean to that, but I know what she did was extremely remarkable at a time that was so challenging. And for me to be a young African girl observing that from afar, it was remarkable for me to see her do what she did with that courage. And I think, for me, the conversation around Nelson is not complete without recognizing her contribution and honoring that for sure. So those are my
Thank
two.
you
My
for
three. You asked for one, I gave you three.
Yes, yes, thank you, thank you. And so as we wrap here, are there any calls to action for listeners that you'd like to share?
I'll say let's do the work. Let's do it differently. Don't be afraid of the unknown, or don't be afraid of the different. Right? I think a lot of it falls on us othering. And again, when we are afraid of folks, we don't do the due diligence of actually listening to each other, giving that gift of acceptance and saying, you might be different, but I see the commonality. We're humans, we have, challenges, varying degrees. So I think it's that. So it's really embracing the fact that change is possible, but it's going to be hard, right? But it's possible. And so we need to create this environment of learning. So call in, give grace, understand that, yes, we are different, but it's okay. That difference does make a difference, right? And so let's suspend judgment and really just embrace our uniqueness. And again, think about it also not as a zero-sum game, because I think a lot of the fear stems on, well, if we create equity in this space, so if we look at, certain space, then we're denying somebody. We all benefit. We all benefit. Everyone benefits from this work being done right. Yeah.
Thank you, Jackie. It's been so great to get to know you better. We look forward to seeing you as you are your own catalyst for change in this work. Thank you for casting a vision for how this work can be done sustainably and long term, and making it more of a focal point in our work and our business and our personal lives as well.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I know you're doing tremendous work. I know I've known Shannon for years, and I followed her closely. And I know, Tracy as well. I know she's not on the call, but I know the work that you're doing is important. And these are the types of conversations we need to be having. So thank you. Thank you both for the honor of having this conversation and inviting me to it, and for the work you do.
Thank you so much for listening. If you'd like to learn more about how to accelerate positive change, go to our website at catalystconstellations.com.
And be sure to check out our book, Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out. If you have other catalysts in your life, hit the share button and send a link their way. Thank you so much, Jackie.